The observation theater at the Galactic Academy was packed that morning. Students whispered to each other as they settled into their seats, their voices creating a nervous hum that filled the curved walls. Some were excited. Most were afraid. They had all heard the rumors about what Professor Velrith had arranged for today's lesson, and none of them could quite believe it was actually happening. Professor Velrith stood at the center of the floor, his crystalline body catching the light and scattering it across the room in pale blue fragments. He was old by his species standards, a respected scholar who had spent 2 centuries studying the galaxy's most dangerous creatures. Today would be the crowning achievement of his career. Today he had brought a human. The doors at the back of the theater slid open with a hiss. Every head turned. Security drones floated in first, their weapons charged and ready, red targeting lights sweeping the space. Then he walked in. Derek Walsh looked nothing like the monsters from the stories. He was average height for his species, maybe 6 feet tall, with brown hair that was starting to gray at the temples. He wore work pants, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and boots that had seen better days. His hands hung loose at his sides. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes gave him away. They pointed straight forward like a predator's, like something that hunted. A student in the 3rd row made a small sound of distress. Another moved back in their seat, pressing against the cushion as if they could somehow create more distance. Derek noticed. He always noticed. But he kept walking until he reached the reinforced platform at the center of the floor. Force fields hummed to life around him, creating a cage of shimmering energy that made the air smell like ozone. Professor Velrith activated his lecture display. A holographic image of a human body appeared, rotating slowly in the air. "Class, please direct your attention to the specimen," he began using his teaching voice. "What you are observing is a representative sample of species classification Deathworlder Predator, subsection Apex category. Native designation is human, originating from the 3rd planet of the Sol system." Derek stood perfectly still on his platform. He had been standing still for 3 hours yesterday during the preliminary examinations. He could do it again. The colony needed the funding this appearance would bring. Kids back home needed medicine, water recyclers, basic supplies. So he could handle being stared at like an animal in a zoo. "Note the ocular positioning," Velrith continued, gesturing with one of his many limbs. "Forward-facing eyes provide binocular vision, allowing precise depth perception necessary for pursuing prey. This is in stark contrast to civilized species, who retain peripheral vision structures suited for detecting threats." He walked closer to Derek, holding up a scanning device. The specimen mass is approximately 90 kilograms, but observe the density. Musculature comprises 42% of total body mass. Their planet's gravitational force is 1.7 times our standard, requiring significant structural reinforcement merely to function. A student with tentacles instead of arms raised one timidly. "Professor, is the specimen sapient? Can it understand us?" Velrith's crystalline face shifted into what might have been a smile. "The species possesses technical sapience, yes. They have developed language, mathematics, basic technology. However, their cognitive processes remain heavily influenced by predatory instincts. Think of them as intelligent but not civilized. Not as we understand civilization." Derek's jaw tightened. He wanted to say something, to defend himself and every other human who had worked and sacrificed to earn their place among the stars. But the contract was clear. He was here as an educational specimen. Nothing more. The professor continued his lecture. Circling the platform like Derek was a particularly interesting rock formation. The dental structure is especially revealing. Observe the incisors, designed for tearing. The canines, though reduced from their evolutionary ancestors, still present as pointed structures. The molars combine grinding and cutting surfaces, indicating an omnivorous predator capable of consuming both plant and animal tissue. He paused for effect. Their own planet's wildlife. Gasps rippled through the audience. A gelatinous student in the back actually flowed partially out of their seat in shock. "Exactly," Velrith said, pleased with the reaction. "Humans are predators that evolved by hunting and consuming the other creatures of their world. They chased prey animals across vast distances until exhaustion caused collapse. They coordinated in packs. They developed thrown weapons to kill from a distance. Every aspect of their biology speaks to violence, to the taking of life for sustenance." Derek looked at the faces staring at him. Fear. Disgust. Morbid fascination. A few looked at him the way someone might look at a black hole, something dangerous and incomprehensible that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. None of them saw a person. They saw a monster that happened to walk upright and speak. One brave student, smaller than the others and covered in soft purple fur, raised a paw-like hand. "Professor, if they are so dangerous, how did they ever stop fighting long enough to discover space travel? Wouldn't they have destroyed themselves?" Velrith made a dismissive gesture. "An excellent question. The prevailing theory suggests that predatory species occasionally achieve a temporary equilibrium, a pause in their violent nature that allows for brief periods of technological advancement. How long this equilibrium lasts remains to be seen. Many xenobiologists believe humans will inevitably return to their aggressive patterns." Derek breathed slowly through his nose. He thought about his daughter back on the colony, about teaching her to track deer through the woods last autumn, about explaining why they only took what they needed, why they thanked the animal for its sacrifice, why they used every part and wasted nothing. That wasn't violence. That was respect. That was understanding your place in the world. But nobody here wanted to hear that. "Tomorrow," Professor Velrith announced, "we will conduct live response testing. You will witness firsthand how predatory instincts manifest under stimulus conditions. I assure you it will be quite illuminating." His crystalline body flickered with satisfaction. Class dismissed. The students filed out, still whispering, still throwing nervous glances back at the human in the cage. Derek remained on the platform, surrounded by humming force fields, and wondered if any amount of money was worth this humiliation. The next day, Derek found himself standing in a different kind of cage. The testing arena was circular, about 50 feet across, with white floors and walls that glowed with a soft light. Sensor equipment lined the ceiling, tracking his every movement. The observation windows above were packed with students, their faces pressed against the glass like children at an aquarium. Professor Velrith's voice came through the speakers, clinical and detached. "Begin response trial sequence 1. Without warning, holographic targets materialized around Derek. Some looked like creatures, others like geometric shapes. They appeared and disappeared in random patterns, some moving fast, others slow. A red target lunged at him from the left. Derek's body moved before his brain finished processing the threat. His hand came up, his weight shifted, ready to deflect or dodge. The movement was smooth, efficient, automatic. The room fell silent. On the displays above, numbers scrolled past faster than most species could read. Response time, threat assessment, reaction speed. Every metric was being measured, quantified, turned into data. "Extraordinary," Velrith murmured, and Derek could hear the professor's voice echoing through the observation deck. "Note the reaction speed. 0.12 seconds from stimulus to physical response. That is 3.4 times faster than the galactic average for sapient species." More targets appeared. Derek moved through them like water, his body finding the most efficient path, his eyes tracking multiple threats simultaneously. It felt natural to him, no different than walking or breathing. But to the watching aliens it looked like something else entirely. It looked like death waiting to happen. The testing continued for 20 minutes. Pattern recognition exercises where Derek identified threats among neutral images. Spatial awareness trials where objects came at him from multiple angles. Threat assessment scenarios where he had to decide which targets were actually dangerous. His scores broke the upper limits of what the equipment was designed to measure. When the holograms finally shut off, Derek stood in the center of the arena, breathing slightly harder but otherwise unchanged. Sweat dampened his shirt. His heart rate was elevated but not dangerously so. To him it had been a workout. To the watching students, it had been a glimpse into how apex predators operated. Professor Velrith descended into the arena, his crystalline body refracting the overhead lights. "Specimen, we will now conduct the interview portion of today's demonstration. Please describe your cognitive process during the trials." Derek wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "What do you want to know? When the threats appeared, what were you thinking? What drove your responses?" "I was watching for patterns," Derek said simply. "Looking at behavior, speed, approach angles. Trying to predict what would happen next so I could respond appropriately." A student's voice came through the speakers, timid and confused. "But you moved so fast. How could you be thinking at all?" Derek looked up at the observation windows, finding the source of the voice. It was the small purple-furred student from yesterday. "Training. Practice. When you do something enough times, your body learns to act while your mind is still processing. It is not about not thinking. It is about thinking faster." Velrith made a note on his data pad. "Interesting rationalization. The predatory instinct masquerading as conscious decision-making." "It is not instinct," Derek said, a edge creeping into his voice. "It is skill. Before the professor could respond, another student spoke up. The voice belonged to Trill, a small amphibious being with large gentle eyes. Derek, may I ask you something? The use of his actual name caught Derek off guard. Most of the students had been calling him the specimen or the human or worse, nothing at all. Sure, he said. Target 17 in the sequence. You hesitated. Why? Derek thought back through the exercise, remembering. The small one that came from behind? Yes. Your response time on that target was significantly slower. 0.4 seconds instead of your average of 0.12. Derek nodded slowly. It was smaller. Different movement pattern. Looked like a juvenile, not a full-grown threat. I needed an extra moment to assess whether it was actually dangerous or just scared. The observation deck went quiet. Students looked at each other, confused. Velrith's translator crackled with what might have been surprise. You differentiated based on age assessment? Of course, Derek said. A scared kid acts different than an actual threat. You do not respond to them the same way. Trill leaned forward in their seat. Can you explain more about how you made that determination? Derek shrugged. Body language mostly. The way it moved was erratic, panicked. Real threats move with purpose. They commit to their attacks. That target was hesitating, like it did not really want to engage. That is fear behavior, not aggression. Another student, this one with multiple eye stalks, spoke up. But how do you know the difference? How can you read those signals? Practice, Derek said again. But also understanding. You have to know what you are looking at. Fear and anger look similar at first, but they are not the same. A frightened animal is dangerous because it is unpredictable. An angry one is dangerous because it has decided to hurt you. Different threats require different responses. Professor Velrith interjected, trying to regain control of his demonstration. What the specimen is describing is an advanced predatory assessment matrix. The ability to categorize prey by vulnerability and threat level. No, Derek said firmly. That is not what I am describing at all. The professor's crystalline structure flickered with irritation. Then please enlighten us. Derek took a breath, choosing his words carefully. When I was 12, my grandfather took me hunting for the first time. We tracked a deer for 3 hours through the woods back home. When we finally found it, it was a doe with a fawn. My grandfather made me watch them for 20 minutes. Then he turned around and we went home empty-handed. I don't understand the relevance, Velrith said. He taught me that hunting is not about killing. It is about understanding. About knowing when to act and when to walk away. About respecting what you are part of. Derek looked around at the faces watching him. You keep calling it instinct like I am just reacting without thought. But it is the opposite. It is about being so aware, so connected to what is happening around you, that you make better decisions, not worse ones. Trill was writing frantically on their data pad. So when you hunted animals on your world, it was not just for food? Food was part of it, Derek admitted. But my grandfather taught me it was about balance. About understanding that we are part of the ecosystem, not separate from it. Every animal we took, we used completely. Nothing wasted. We hunted older males past breeding age or managed populations that were growing too large for the habitat to support. It was not about violence. It was about responsibility. A brave student in the back asked the question many were thinking. But you have technology now. You can synthesize food. Why hunt at all? 3 days later, Derek was back in the observation theater. The routine had become almost normal. Stand on the platform, answer questions, endure being analyzed like a lab specimen. Professor Velrith was mid-lecture, explaining human cardiovascular efficiency to a room full of students taking dutiful notes, when everything changed. The alarm started as a low pulse, then built to a shrieking wail that made everyone freeze. Red emergency lights flooded the theater, turning everything the color of blood. The holographic displays flickered and died. Somewhere in the distance, something metallic screamed as it tore apart. Professor Velrith's translator crackled with incoming messages. His crystalline body went dark, then flashed bright with what Derek had learned was fear. Containment breach, the professor said, his voice shaking. Exotic specimens wing. Multiple organisms loose in the station. The students erupted into chaos. Some ran for the exits. Others froze in their seats, paralyzed by panic. A few started crying, making sounds Derek had never heard before, sounds that transcended species and meant the same thing in any language. Terror. Another impact shook the station. The floor tilted slightly, then corrected itself. Emergency systems kicked in, sealing blast doors throughout the facility. The theater's main exit slammed shut with a boom that made everyone jump. Then they all heard it. A sound that came from somewhere deep in the station's corridors, echoing through the ventilation systems and structural supports. It was not quite a roar, not quite a scream. It was the sound of something big, something angry, and something that knew how to hunt. Derek felt his skin prickle. Every hair on his arm stood up. His body recognized that sound even if his mind had never heard it before. That was a hunting call. That was an apex predator announcing its presence. "Carewell," Professor Velrith whispered, and his whole body went pale. "Class Omega Predator. Threshold Gamma classification. Oh no. Oh no no no." A student with tentacles raised a shaking limb. "Professor, what do we do?" "Lockdown protocol," Velrith said, but his voice had no strength in it. "We stay here. We wait for security forces to contain the situation. Nobody moves. Nobody makes noise." Derek watched the professor's hands shake as he tried to access the station's security network. The display showed chaos. Creatures of various sizes and danger levels were loose throughout 3 entire sections. But the KRLL was the real problem. On the security footage, Derek caught a glimpse of it. 9 feet tall, armored hide, claws that looked like they could peel open starship hulls. It moved through the corridors with terrifying purpose, hunting by sound and heat. And it was heading toward the dormitory sector. "How many students in the dorms right now?" Derek asked quietly. Velrith looked at him like he had forgotten the human was even there. "What?" "The dormitories. How many people?" 300? Maybe more. It is rest cycle for the second-year cohorts." The professor's crystalline structure flickered rapidly. "Security is responding. They will handle it." Derek looked at the security feed. He could see the security team assembling near Section 4, but their hands were shaking so badly they could barely hold their weapons. One of them was hyperventilating. Another looked ready to pass out. These were people who had trained in simulations, practiced on targets that did not fight back. They had never faced anything that actually wanted to kill them. The KRLL's hunting call echoed through the station again, closer this time. On the feed, it appeared at the end of a corridor, its massive head swinging back and forth as it tracked something. Then it charged, moving faster than something that size should be able to move. The security team scattered. One of them fired a weapon, but his hands were shaking so badly the shot went wide, scorching the wall. Derek did the math in his head. The KRLL was 6 corridors away from the dormitories. At its current speed, maybe 3 minutes. The security team was falling back, not advancing. They were too scared to be effective. "Professor," Derek said, and his voice cut through the panicked noise in the theater. "Drop the containment field." Velrith stared at him like he had suggested jumping out an airlock. "Absolutely not. You are contained for everyone's safety. Regulations clearly state." "There are 300 kids about to die," Derek interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Your security team is not going to stop that thing. They're too scared. They have never dealt with real danger before. And you have." Velrith's voice cracked with stress and anger. "Yes," Derek said simply. "Drop the field. Let me help. You are a predator. How do we know you would not make things worse?" Derek pointed at the security feed where the KRYL had just torn through a reinforced door like it was paper. "Worse than that? Professor, I have tracked mountain lions through snow. I have dealt with angry bears protecting cubs. I know what it looks like when something is hunting and I know how to respond. Your people do not." A student in the front row spoke up. It was Trill, the small amphibious being who had been asking Derek questions all week. "How long until security contains it, Professor?" Velrith checked his display with trembling hands. Estimated response time, 8 to 10 minutes for proper containment team deployment. "The dormitories are 3 minutes away," Trill said quietly. Then, before the professor could stop them, Trill reached over and pressed the emergency release on the containment field controls. The force field around Derek died with an electronic whine. Velrith made a sound of protest, but Derek was already moving. He jumped down from the platform and headed for the sealed door. "Wait," Velrith called out. "You have no weapons. No armor. No backup." Derek paused at the door, his hand on the emergency release. "I do not need to kill it, Professor. I just need to keep it away from those kids until your people get their act together." He looked back over his shoulder. "That is what predators do. The good ones anyway. We protect the herd." He hit the release and the door slid open. The sound of alarms and distant crashes flooded in. Derek took one breath, centered himself like his grandfather had taught him, and walked into the chaos. Behind him, the theater fell silent. Then, as one, every student turned to look at the security feeds. Trill pulled up the station map, tracking Derek's movement through the corridors. "He is heading toward it," Trill whispered. "Not away. Toward." On the screens, they watched the human move through damaged hallways with careful, purposeful steps. He paused at intersections, tilted his head to listen, changed direction based on sounds they could not hear. He was tracking. Hunting. But not for prey. He was hunting the hunter. Professor Velrith stood frozen at his podium, watching the human disappear deeper into the station. Around him, students who had spent all week learning about Deathworld predators were about to learn the difference between studying danger in a classroom and watching someone walk straight into it. The KRWL's hunting call echoed through the speakers again. On the feed, Derek changed direction, moving faster now. And in the observation theater, 36 students held their breath and watched a human do what humans had been doing since they first learned to make fire and sharpen sticks. He went toward the danger while everyone else ran away. Derek moved through the damaged corridors like he was walking through familiar woods. The flickering emergency lights cast strange shadows, and the air smelled like burnt wiring and something else, something organic and wrong. But he had learned a long time ago that fear was just information. It told you to pay attention. It did not tell you to run. In the observation theater, every student was pressed against the security monitors. Trill had pulled up multiple camera angles, tracking Derek's progress through the station. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked away. Derek stopped at an intersection and crouched down. His fingers traced the deep gouges in the wall plating, for parallel lines that had torn through metal like it was cardboard. "Fresh," he muttered to himself even though nobody could hear him. The edges of the cuts were still warm to the touch. "What is he doing?" a student whispered. Trill leaned closer to the screen. "He is reading the marks. Look at how he is examining the depth and angle. He is learning how it moves." Derek stood and looked down the corridor. More claw marks, these ones higher up. The Carol was tall, taller than him by at least 3 feet. It had reach and weight and natural armor. In a straight fight, Derek would lose badly. But his grandfather had taught him that the best hunters never got into straight fights. He tilted his head, listening. The station's damaged systems created a symphony of sounds. Groaning metal, hissing pipes, sparking wires. But underneath it all, he heard breathing. Heavy, rhythmic, coming from somewhere to his left. The Carwello was close. Too close to the dormitories. Derek looked around until he found what he needed. A broken pipe hung from the ceiling, about 3 feet of solid metal. He grabbed it and tested the weight. Not a great weapon, but it would make noise. That was what mattered. He dragged the pipe across an exposed support beam. The sound rang out like a bell, echoing through the empty corridors. Then he did it again, louder this time. A challenge. A distraction. "Come this way instead of that way. Come toward me instead of them." The KRWL's response was immediate. Its hunting call split the air, but this time it came from a different direction. It had heard. It was turning. "He changed its path," Professor Velrith said, his voice barely audible. "It was heading toward Dormitory Section B. Now it is moving toward Maintenance Level 3. "That is where Derek is," another student said. "I know." On the screen, Derek was already moving. He did not run straight away. Instead, he moved at an angle, making noise as he went, leaving a trail any predator could follow. He knocked over maintenance equipment. He dragged the pipe across walls. He made himself impossible to ignore. The Carwell appeared on one of the camera feeds, its massive form filling the corridor. Its head swung back and forth, tracking the sounds. Then it charged toward where Derek had been, its claws tearing chunks out of the floor with each step. But Derek was not there anymore. He had already turned down a side passage, circling around, repositioning. On the map, Trill traced his route with one finger. He is leading it. Away from populated areas. Toward the empty sections. For the next 4 minutes, the students watched something they would never forget. Derek moved through the station like he was conducting an orchestra. Make noise here, draw the KRYL that direction. Let it get close enough to stay interested but not close enough to catch him. Use the station's layout like terrain, bottlenecking the creature's movement, forcing it down specific paths. He passed through a section with exposed coolant pipes. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Derek kept moving, but his breath came out in clouds now. The cold would slow the KRL down just a little. Every advantage mattered. A student with multiple eye stalks watched the thermal overlay. His heart rate is elevated but stable. How is he so calm? He is not calm, Trill said quietly. Look at his hands. They are shaking. He is terrified. But he is doing it anyway. Derek reached a junction where 3 corridors met. This was the place. It had to be here. To his right was the path to the cargo bay. Wide open space, high ceiling, and most importantly, a secondary entrance he could use to escape. To his left and straight ahead were paths that led deeper into the station, toward areas where people might still be sheltering. He took the metal pipe and slammed it against the wall. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound rang out like a dinner bell. Then he walked into the middle of the junction and waited. The Caruelo came around the corner at full speed. When it saw Derek standing there, alone and small and so obviously prey, it did not hesitate. It charged. Derek ran toward the cargo bay. Not in a panic but with purpose. Fast enough to stay ahead but not so fast that the Caruelo would lose interest. He could hear it behind him, its claws scraping against the floor, its breath coming in aggressive huffs. The smell hit him like a wall, alien and sharp and predatory. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. When something is chasing you, you are in control of where it goes. Make it commit. Make it follow. Derek burst through the cargo bay doors. The space opened up around him, easily 100 feet across. Storage containers were stacked along the walls, creating a maze of potential cover. The ceiling was 30 feet high, crisscrossed with support beams and loading equipment. The KRL followed him in, its hunting call echoing off the metal walls. Now that it had Derek in an open space, it slowed down. This was its moment. The prey had nowhere left to run. Derek backed toward the center of the bay. His hands were empty now. He had dropped the pipe somewhere in the corridors. He had no weapons, no armor, nothing but the knowledge his grandfather had given him and the understanding that predators were predictable if you knew what to look for. The Caruelo circled him, its massive head low, its eyes tracking every movement. Derek made himself bigger. He spread his arms wide, standing as tall as he could. Then he did something that made every student watching gasp in horror. He roared. It came from deep in his chest, a primal sound that humans had been making since before they discovered fire. Not a challenge to fight but a signal. I am not prey. I am a threat. Reconsider. The KRYL hesitated. Its head tilted slightly, confused. This small creature should be running, should be cowering. But it was acting like something dangerous. The predator's instincts warred with each other. Attack the threat or avoid it? Derek took a step sideways. Not back, not forward. Sideways. The KRL's eyes tracked the movement. Derek took another step, angling toward the secondary entrance on the far side of the bay. The KRL moved with him, maintaining distance, watching. Territorial behavior, Professor Velrith whispered. The KRL thinks Derek is challenging for territory. It is confused. Derek kept moving, kept making himself large, kept that aggressive posture even though every muscle in his body was screaming to run. He could see the secondary entrance now 20 feet away. 15. 10. The KRL decided. It charged. Derek dove for the door. His hand slammed the control panel and he rolled through as the door started to close. The KRL crashed into the closing gap, its claws scraping against the metal, but Derek was already on the other side. He hit the emergency lock and the doors sealed with a heavy clunk. Inside the cargo bay, the KRL threw itself against the doors. The metal buckled but held. It was contained. Derek slumped against the wall, breathing hard. His legs shook. His hands trembled. Adrenaline flooded his system, making everything feel sharp and distant at the same time. But he had done it. The thing was trapped and nobody had died. He tapped his comm unit with a shaking hand. Cargo Bay 7. It is sealed in there. Send your containment team. In the observation theater, the students sat in absolute silence. They had just watched a human, armed with nothing but knowledge and courage, contain a Class Omega predator without firing a single shot. Without killing it. Trill looked at Professor Velrith. The professor's crystalline body was flickering rapidly, processing what they had all just witnessed. Still think it was just predatory instinct? Trill asked quietly. Velrith did not answer. 1 week later, the xenobiology class assembled again in the observation theater. But everything was different now. The force field platform sat dark and unused in the corner. The security feeds had been shut off. And Derek Walsh stood at the front of the room not as a specimen but as a guest. Professor Velrith cleared his throat, his crystalline body flickering with something that might have been embarrassment. Class, I have prepared today's lecture on the continued analysis of Deathworlder species and their predatory adaptations. His voice lacked its usual confidence. He pulled up his notes, then paused. However, I believe we may have been approaching this subject from an incomplete perspective. Trill raised their hand from the front row. The small amphibious student had barely slept all week, spending every free moment reviewing the footage of Derek's encounter with the KRL. "Professor, may I ask a question?" Velrith gestured for them to continue. "We have spent 3 years studying predator species as specimens, as threats, as things to be feared and categorized and kept at a distance." Trill looked around at their classmates. "But we never asked what we could learn from them. What they understand that we have forgotten." The theater fell quiet. Students shifted in their seats. Some nodded slowly. Others looked uncomfortable. Trill continued, their voice gaining strength. "Derek saved 300 lives without killing anything. Without weapons or armor or backup. He did something our entire security force could not do, and he did it by understanding the threat instead of just fearing it. So my question is this: what else have we dismissed as primitive that might actually be wisdom?" A student with tentacles spoke up from the middle row. "But Trill, they are predators. Their whole evolution is based on violence and killing. How can that be wisdom?" Derek had been standing quietly, letting the students talk. Now he stepped forward slightly. "Can I answer that?" Professor Velrith nodded, though he looked like he was watching his entire career's worth of theories crumble around him. "You are right," Derek said, addressing the tentacled student directly. "My ancestors were predators. They hunted and killed to survive. But you are missing half the story." He walked to the center of the floor, the same spot where he had stood in a cage just days ago. "Predators do not just know how to hunt. They have to know their prey. They have to understand behavior, predict movement, read the environment. A bad predator just attacks everything. They waste energy, they get injured, they starve. Good predators learn." He looked around at the watching faces. "My grandfather taught me to hunt when I was young. First thing he taught me was not how to shoot or track. It was how to sit still and watch. We spent entire days just observing deer, learning how they moved, what scared them, what made them feel safe. He taught me that if you do not understand what you are hunting, you have no business being in the woods." A student with scales and multiple eyes raised a claw. "But that is just hunting strategy. What does that have to do with what happened with the KRYLL?" "Everything," Derek said. "That KRYLL was not evil. It was not a monster. It was a scared, confused predator in a strange environment. It was reacting to threat stimuli, defending what it perceived as territory, following instincts that had kept its species alive for millions of years. Your security team saw a dangerous animal and panicked. I saw a frightened creature that could be redirected if you understood what it was responding to." Trill was taking notes frantically. "So the predatory evolution that we classify as a threat factor is actually what allowed you to understand the KRYLL's behavior?" "Exactly," Derek said. "You have to think like what you are dealing with. Predators understand other predators. We recognize the signs, the body language, the decision-making process. It is not magic. It is just knowing what to look for." Professor Velrith finally spoke, his voice subdued. "But surely this is a specialized case. The ability to handle one dangerous situation does not invalidate centuries of research into Deathworlder psychology." Derek turned to face the professor directly. "With respect, sir, I think your research has been answering the wrong questions. You have been studying what makes species dangerous. But you have not been studying what makes them capable. There is a difference." Another student, this one covered in soft fur, raised a paw nervously. "What do you mean by capable?" Derek thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Every species in this galaxy evolved to survive their environment, right? He pointed to the furred student. "Your species evolved on a peaceful world with abundant resources. You developed art, philosophy, mathematics. That is beautiful. That is valuable." He gestured to others around the room. "Same with most of you. Gentle worlds that let you focus on building civilizations without constantly fighting for survival." He paused. "But some of us came from harder places. Worlds where you had to understand danger because ignoring it meant death. Where you had to make hard decisions because hesitating meant your family starved. Where you had to face your fears because there was nobody else to do it." His voice was steady, not aggressive, just honest. "That does not make us better. But it does make us different. We learn things you did not have to learn. And maybe, just maybe, those things have value too." The theater was absolutely silent now. Students who had spent all week processing what they had witnessed were finally hearing the words to describe it. Trill stood up, their small frame somehow seeming larger. "Professor, I formally request that we restructure this course. Not to study Deathworlders as threats, but to learn from them as teachers. To understand what their evolution can teach us about aspects of survival and decision-making that our own peaceful evolution never required us to develop." Other students began nodding. Then more. Within moments, 24 hands and appendages were raised in agreement. Professor Velrith looked at his class, then at Derek, then at his carefully prepared notes about predatory psychology and Deathworlder threat assessment. His crystalline body flickered through several colors as he processed this fundamental challenge to everything he had built his career on. Finally he spoke. I believe you may be correct. The words seemed to cost him something, but he said them anyway. We have been so focused on categorizing and containing Deathworld species that we never considered what we might learn if we simply listened to them. He looked at Derek. You said that predators protect the herd. I dismissed that as rationalization. But you proved it. You put yourself between danger and 300 students you had never met, who had spent days treating you like a caged animal. Why? Derek shrugged. Because they needed help and I could provide it. Is not that what anyone would do? No, Velrith said quietly. It is not. Most species would have fled. Self-preservation is the most basic biological imperative. But you ran toward danger. So did your ancestors, I assume, for thousands of generations. Not because you are violent but because someone had to. He turned to address the full class. I believe we need to reconsider our entire classification system. The term, Deathworlder, implies these species are defined by their capacity for violence. But perhaps they are actually defined by their capacity to face violence when necessary. There is a profound difference. A student in the back row spoke up. Professor, if we have been wrong about humans, how many other species have we misclassified? How many have declined to join the Galactic Council because we treated them as threats instead of potential teachers? The question hung in the air. Velrith pulled up a star map showing the Council's territory. Then he overlaid data showing species who had been contacted but declined membership. The number was staggering. Hundreds of civilizations, many from high-gravity or competitive evolution worlds, had chosen isolation over integration. Oh, Velrith said softly. Oh no. We have been doing this for centuries. Trill looked at Derek. If we reached out again, with respect instead of fear, with genuine interest in learning instead of categorizing, do you think they would respond differently? Derek smiled slightly. I think most people, no matter what planet they are from, just want to be seen as people. Not as specimens. Not as threats. Just as folks who might have something valuable to contribute. He looked around the theater. You have built something amazing out here. A civilization based on peace and cooperation and shared knowledge. That is incredible. But you have also lost something along the way. You have forgotten that danger exists, and when you forget that, you lose the ability to face it. A student with scales raised their voice. So we need predators to protect us? No, Derek said firmly. You need to remember that courage matters. That someone has to stand between the threat and the people who cannot. That skill and knowledge and training have value beyond academic theory. He gestured to the empty force field platform. I am not special. I am just someone whose ancestors had to learn certain things to survive. But those things, that knowledge, it should not be dismissed as primitive. It should be recognized as a different kind of wisdom. Professor Velrith began compiling data with renewed purpose. I am going to petition the Council for a complete review of species classifications. I am going to recommend we establish cultural exchange programs with Deathworlder species. And Derek, he turned to face the human, I would like to offer you a position here at the Academy. Not as a specimen. As an instructor. We need someone to teach what you know. Not just to xenobiology students but to security forces, emergency responders, anyone who might face danger and needs to understand how to think clearly when fear tries to take over. Derek was quiet for a moment. I need to check with my family. The colony needs me and I made promises. We can arrange funding for your colony as part of your compensation, Velrith said quickly. Medical supplies, water treatment systems, whatever they need. This is too important. Around the theater, students were already pulling up data, making plans, restructuring their entire understanding of how the galaxy fit together. The conversation grew louder, more animated, more excited. Trill approached Derek as the class session dissolved into enthusiastic chaos. Thank you, the small being said, for showing us we were wrong. For doing it with patience instead of anger. Derek looked down at them. You were not wrong. You just had incomplete information. That is not the same thing. And you, he pointed at Trill, you were the one brave enough to ask better questions. That took courage too. As Derek left the observation theater that day, the force field platform remained dark in the corner. It would never be used again. The Academy would send out new proposals to dozens of species previously classified as too dangerous for integration. And in classrooms across the station, students would begin learning a new lesson, that the galaxy was not divided into the civilized and the savage, but into those who faced the hard truths of existence and those who had been fortunate enough to never have to. And sometimes, just sometimes, the best teachers were the ones you had been too afraid to learn from.